Well, this is Unfragmented, where we are proud to say in a good way that we're inspired by Colossians 1:16 and 17. For by him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And here on Unfragmented, we strive to connect Christian thought with Christian action. That's our goal. Today is August 23rd, 2023. And very briefly, I'll just direct you to deconstructingthecoliseum.com, where I want you to listen to an old radio segment that I did entitled, Those Who Criticize Our Generation Forget Who Raised It. Man, we want to do a good job with raising subsequent generations, our kids, our grandchildren, and so on. I'm joined by Lee Borton and Nicole Parks, Michelle Knapp, and Jennifer Eck. And of course, Emma Bortons is our producer. And this month we are reading, we're reading James Tooley's The Beautiful Tree. It's a wonderful book about private education. And last week we discussed just a few things here, how it should be socially acceptable to hold others accountable. That's a good thing. How the real world families that Mr. Tooley introduces us to are, for the most part, led by a father and a mother. And then in Mr. Tooley's book, we read about how there is a denial by the elites and civil government, not only in China and India and Ghana, but other countries also, about how private schools exist in those respective countries. And you go to Lee Borton's YouTube channel for the archive shows. And this week, I'm proud to say that we're joined by Dr. Nick Ellis, and he is the founder and CEO of Christian Halls International. He has founded or led various organizations in North America, Brazil, Africa, and Europe. Dr. Ellis was educated at the University of Oxford, where he earned his Doctor of Philosophy and Master's in Theology and Religion. Also Trinity Western University, where he earned a Master's of New Testament. And then finally Union University, where he also earned a Bachelor's of Biblical Languages. And Dr. Ellis, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks, Kevin.
I want to do two things just briefly with you so that all of us can get to know you, and just ask you, first of all, were you privately educated? If you would, just share with us a little about that, please.
Yeah, so we were homeschooled, first in the States. With my folks had started educating us in Texas back in 83, 84. And so kind of the early days of homeschooling in Texas. And then we moved to Brazil in the mid 90s. And back in those days, we moved to the far North Amazon, and the most missionaries would send their kids to a boarding school. And mom just said, we're just not going to do that. We're going to invest in our kids. There's 5 of us siblings. And so mom and dad invested in a shipping container, filled it full of books, and started the first classical library of North Brazil. And so basically my education was divided between fishing peacock bass during the afternoons and reading great books during the morning. And that was my early education. And then from there, after Brazil, I left Brazil to go to university and began my educational journey from there. So yes, privately educated all the way through, and educated within a parentally governed system, which I think is also quite important.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we can all appreciate that. And that's what we've been talking about throughout this book club, Unfragmented. And then I just want to ask you, now we've read your biography, and I've talked to you personally once about what it is you do. And admittedly, I don't think like you do. So I just want to ask you if you could break it down for me and others and just explain to us plainly what it is you do for a living and how it is you help advance Christian education.
Yeah, that's good. Well, thank you. Well, for many, many years, until really about 5 years ago in Brazil, it was a completely criminalized offense to provide parentally governed education. And so we were really the first ones that we knew of in Brazil that were engaged in homeschooling. And non-governmentally regulated education. And so all five of us are fairly successful, both professionally and academically. And so as we begin to kind of go about our professional lives, I was at the University of Oxford at the time teaching. I teach in Hellenistic Greek and classics and theology. And so I think my third year teaching at Oxford, got a call from mom from Brazil, which is always dangerous. Anytime mom calls, there there's going to be some sort of very kind, insistent ask involved. And I'm sure Lee knows that, having worked extensively with my mom for many years. And really, it was a question of, hope you're enjoying your time in Oxford. I know it's a wonderful place. What about Brazil? What about our families here? And we began to have long discussions around what it would look like to begin to push for the decriminalization of parentally governed education in Brazil. And we basically decided under our kind of family organization, which is Aspen International, that mom and I would kind of take two sides of the equation. I would help her on the K-12 side and find the right partners, including Classical Conversations. We launched Classical Press as a publishing house to resource Brazil. But we were running into the wood chipper of the kind of Marxist Catholic hegemony that runs the university system in Brazil and has for decades. And so we were running into the wood chipper of higher education and just said, okay, we're going to have to solve those problems as well. And so as we were starting parentally governed communities in K-12, in publishing, and various other initiatives, working on the political space, working in the legal space, we began to expand in the university side as well. So Christian Halls International was birthed as a way of going into local communities, identifying local tutors and subject matter experts, and building small cohorts of what we call is a Christian Hall. And those Christian Halls are basically tutoring groups, identifying those parents and subject matter experts in their area that want to retake governance, not just in the K-12 space, but push that out beyond into the post-secondary space. And to do that, we've partnered with about a dozen different universities and seminaries. We have about 400 degrees from dual credit through PhD that we can deploy into these communities. And so we divide the work, the labor between what I would call our vendors and our manufacturers, which are our universities, trying to work with them and not having to rebuild lots of different universities and colleges, but putting the power of governance, of authority, and of accountability back into the hands of parents in their communities. We love our universities. I'm a university man. I've invested a good part of my life in the university, but they are really skilled at two very important things, siphoning off talent and siphoning off treasure from local communities with very few ways of sending it back. And so we just said, we have to rethink where the power structure resides. And by basically creating a guild, now a very large network, over 400 microcampuses of locally governed tutoring groups, that's where these subject matter experts, these parents, these pastors can come in and really own the question and own the conversation within these communities. And so students can come in, they can get from dual credit all the way through undergraduate, master's, or PhD. They can receive a low cost, no debt private education in their local community that is governed by the elders of their community. And so it's very important that our universities have a posture of service, and they need accountability. I think a big part of this book that we're reading is accountability. Where there's no accountability, corruption occurs. And so being able to say, if you don't provide a good service, we're going to fire you and we're going to find another service provider. That kind of accountability posture is extremely important for the self-governing communities, not just in K-12, which is, I think in the States, it's very much kind of been normalized, but post-secondary education, which is still, I would say, very much kind of captured by the elite structures. And so that's the space that I work in, specifically in post-secondary community-based mentor-led education. And we have campuses now in East Africa, the US, Brazil, Canada, and trying to find where are those local communities that want to take the governance, it's no longer really a question of financial problems. It's no longer really a question of access to data. It's really a question of having the spiritual and moral courage to step into the post-secondary space that has for too long been outsourced to, in my mind, poor stewards of that age group. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
Oh, that's great. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that we're very thankful for what you do and great thinkers like you. And I just want to ask you one more question before I turn it over to Lee and our other co-hosts here, and that is, I had touched on this last week, something that personally intrigues me. I'm not necessarily like you. I've only been out of the country one time. I've only been to Mexico, and I enjoyed it, but I haven't been to Brazil and Africa and so on. Maybe someday I'll get there. But what intrigues me is that when I read Dr. Tooley's book about parents doing things in different countries, those parents are not necessarily Christians. And so I had to rethink my ideas about conservatism. I'm used to, as an American, attaching conservatism to evangelical Christianity or some version of it, close to it. But what intrigues me about these parents is they seem to me to be acting out some form of conservatism without necessarily being Christians. And what do you see with that? I hope that question makes sense, but in terms of trying to locally problem solve and not rely on the civil authorities and just taking ownership of their children's education.
Wow, what a question. That's great. Here's how I would respond to that. I think that it is very interesting that even in the States, when we start talking about retaking governance or self-governance of higher education, of building local sustainable programs, of maintaining family unity and integrity within the family system and structures, building sustainable family units and family-owned businesses, and having your grandparents at your feet when you die. Things that are that organic and gritty when it comes to questions of winning at life. In the States, the groups that get that immediately, and the response is, give us these resources, we know what to do, are typically our immigrant minority families, because they have these structures still intact. Grandma and grandpa are still in the home. They're not working, with a vision of kind of self aggrandizement. They're not purely governed by the financial questions, unless they really, really have to. They are primarily concerned about the health and flourishing of their children and grandchildren. And I go to South Florida and talk about this, and it's the Haitian community and the Puerto Rican communities and the Brazilian communities that say, oh my gosh, a conservative, family-based, local non-debt community college that actually respects the integrity of our family and doesn't just siphon us off and send us to a state university and marries our children as people that we don't know and send them off to work for Kaiser Permanente somewhere in Michigan. I mean, it's that kind of gritty questions about what is winning at life. And our immigrant families are the ones that are saying, we know what to do with this. Honestly, the ones that have the hardest time with it tend to be majority upper middle class families that have a skewed definition of what does it mean to win at life. So I think that is a unbelievable indictment on us, because it's actually the Christian white upper middle class that are so used to outsourcing and third-partying the stewardship of their children. They're the ones that are having the hardest time breaking the cycle of dependency on the systems. And so I would agree that there is a deep longing for a redefinition or an older definition of what does it mean to flourish as a human.
Because
And
I think
Go ahead,
Oh,
say.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that is why you see these responses in, Uganda and Kenya and China and these other places that we've been reading about, because this is something that's embedded into us in the image of God. This isn't just a conservative evangelical Protestant solution. This is something that is embedded into our very souls. And we look around and we've been seduced to a vision of flourishing that serves others, not our families. So I think that may be bearing the lead somewhat to your question, but I think that somewhere in there is the answer to that. This is not just a white American Protestant response, and it should not be.
Lee, do you have a question now for Dr. Ellis? You have a excerpt or question for him?
I have lots. I hope Jennifer, Michelle, I see Nicole's still struggling with the communications, but good classicals here. Nick, I need you to find some terms for our audience. I love that you said parent-governed education. In order to help us understand what you meant by that phrase, could you give us some other similar phrases to compare that to, like civil governed, or like how would you describe the other forms?
Yeah, you notice that I shied away from the term homeschool, because that really does kind of narrow it to a particular kind of cognitive mechanism in our heads. Parentally governed means that the elders and parents of that most critical of all civic and political and religious structures, the family, are ultimately responsible for the governance of the formation of their children. That's the fundamental definition of what a parentally governed structure looks like. And the moment you move away from that, you get layers upon layers of third-party outsourcing with less and less and less governance. And I think that the most extreme version of this, as you move further and further and further away, is really what you've seen in this book, that there is no accountability, that there is no sense of what is good for my child. You get a lot of teachers unions. That happens a lot. You get a lot of siphoning of funds, because ultimately then those children become feeding troughs for the lives of others, as opposed to the most valuable of our formational resources. And so it inverts the power structure. And so I think those are the kind of questions of who governs this choice. And I think time and time ago in this book, we saw examples of everyone else trying to have a governance role, except for the parents who aren't equipped to make that decision. And so then the question is how many layers of governance away from parental governance do you get when you evaluate an educational system? And I've gotten to the point where that's really my first evaluative principle, is where does the governance lie, and how many degrees of separation from the parent have they allowed that to become third-partied? And the more layers, the more siphoning. The more layers, the more siphoning away of both resources and accountability. So that's how I tend to think in terms of governance as the primary question. It doesn't really matter if it's direct homeschool, and that certainly is we've made that decision. We love that. But you can certainly have parentally governed private schools that are very carefully overseeing 1 layer to 2 layers of subsidiary governance, but the parents are still there to say, no, we are holding you as our federalized representatives accountable, and we'll fire you if you don't do the job. And I think we saw that reflected in the book, that there has to be a power response, a soft power response that says, we're not going to give up the ability of governing in the structure. So those are the layers that I think of when I think about primary governance, subsidiary governance, and third-party outsourcing.
And then you also mentioned that your organization is Christian Halls, and I almost called you Corinne. Kevin just asked you about, in context of Thule's book, because it's not Christians that we're talking to. So your schools that you're working with are across the globe. Calling it Christian Halls, is that making people want to join you, or is that a barrier to joining you?
so far it has not been a barrier, and we were counseled across the board, don't use Christian, don't use Christian, don't use Christian. And the very best thing we could have ever done was to say Christian Halls International, because it defines a number of things. It's very, very clear on the things that drive our value sets. When people ask why, why do you believe in parental governance? We can simply open up and go to Genesis 1. We have an objective model and basis for anthropology and the image of God, and the endowed image of the Creator in us and our children, and all of those kind of federalized structures we have a place to point to. That doesn't mean that they're the only place to point to. You certainly have this kind of within other cultures and other religions, but for us, it's quite clear where our frame of reference is from. And so I think in an increasingly, there's an expression in Portuguese, sem sal, an increasingly saltless, generic, big box, homogenized system, to be able to say, this is what makes us distinctive, and we can argue for it within 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 years of tradition. That gives us a definitional authority, which has been extremely helpful for us in terms of our growth.
Anybody else?
When you were talking about the upper level secondary education, you had said siphoning off talent. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so let me go historical on you. If the first 1,000 years of Christian education was primarily in initially, early proto-monastic communities, Edessa, Caesarea, then Alexandria, and were kind of based within these centers of Christian formation, eventually becoming monastic communities. And then about 1100, and it was very effective. I mean, extremely effective in spreading not just Christianity, but education across certainly the West. And then about 1100, you start to see the rise of cathedral schools and the university systems, mainly because crazy abbots in monasteries do crazy things. And people said, well, we kind of need to provide some quality control on what's going on here. And so there was this centralization, and that was primarily happening in the urban context. And so there were some significant benefits. You see tremendous aggregation of talent. You see tremendous place of learning, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Tulum, all these different places. But instead of the communities being primarily embedded in those communities, I mean, you hear monastery and you probably hear, oh, withdrawn and off by themselves. Well, monastasis, to stand alone, is really a question of its relationship with the church. They're standing apart from the primary church, and they are their own autonomous center, primarily embedded in local communities. That's really the power of the monastic community. As you begin to move away from that and into these university structures, it becomes urbanized and it becomes centralized. And suddenly, to get a quality education, you need to leave your community and you need to go to a town, and you need to, partake of this education, which has extremely strong benefits, but it does two things. It siphons off both talent and treasure, and it centralizes them into the university, and it's not tooled to send it back just by its own design. It doesn't know how to redeploy the talent and treasure back. And so as a result, it ends up, if we're not careful, having taking a governance role and being the beneficiary instead of the service to those communities. And so when I say siphoning off those talent and treasures, again, as a university man, I love Rivendell, but I want to serve the Shire. And if we're not careful, we can make the Shire serve Rivendell. And that's not where the good stuff happens. We want the long-term sustainable health and flourishing in the Shire, not just in our centralized communities.
Right. Okay. That's what I was thinking. So thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I will ramble off all of these these code words, and we need to unpack a lot of the code words that's embedded kind of in these assumptions. So thank you. That's a really, really good question. And also about the whole governance question, also a great question. If there's other dangling chads that you've heard me say, feel free to call me on.
How about you, Jennifer?
I would just say I really appreciate some of the vocabulary that you have given to this, because as I've been reading through the book, I think I have the idea of the parental governance was really resonating with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it because a lot of the things we read feel very much similar to conversations we have or objections we face in the homeschooling community. And yet what we're reading about are these private schools. So to hear you bring that under one umbrella in these parent-governed educations really just brings a lot of light to what we're reading. And did you say that you have read the book you were reading along, or you had not read it?
Yeah, I've read the book, and I've been pleased to reread it with you guys, and it's really interesting. The one example that stood out, we'll say this delicately, but even the decision of the parents when they're saying we would much rather have squatty potties than instead of toilets, as opposed to quality books. Thank you very much. And just because some colonist believes that we should have sit on toilets instead of squatting toilets, and they're trying to decide what our value structures are, what gives them the right to decide that? And that's a very gritty, organic example of parents saying, wait a minute, we know what we want when it comes to human flourishing. And it doesn't mean a European toilet. I mean, that is the kind of parental governance and parental decision-making that we want to be able to say, because then they say, oh, well, they should come to our home. We don't have those things either. I think that's a great quote from the book. We don't have those things either, so they must hate us too. That's the kind of parentally governed decisions that I think we need to be very, very attuned to, because maybe they know something that we don't.
Yes, I think what you're referencing is from chapter 9, where my thoughts were going as you were talking as well. And the author talks through several sort of inputs, I think he calls them, and comparing the public schools with the private schools, and where who excels in the different areas. And I think he had said that one of the only areas where the public schools exceeded the private schools was in their playground structures. And then the parents responded in the way that you had mentioned. And I was wondering if you have a similar experience in the work that you've done, where the families that you're working with are, and it sounds like you have, but I was wondering if you could talk about that in the work that you've done, where you see these families saying, all the bells and whistles aren't what we're after. We want the meat of this.
Yeah. Well, I think the simplest way is to just compare the difference between, let's just take trade school as an example. There's not a single faith-based accredited trade school in the state of Texas. How did that happen? I mean, how did Christianity, which is based around flourishing communities, founded by a carpenter, completely move away from any kind of Christ-centered trade formation? And how do we have simply no one in that space? And this really hit me in the face. I'm a classicist, right? I mean, I don't think about trade schools. And some guy walked into my house about 4 years ago to fix our HVAC system and just spread Jesus through my entire house. And I just said, and just blessed my children, blessed my wife, just blew me away. And I just said, brother, where would you get a quality education and receive a Christian worldview? And of course, I'm a Christian, and we're working within this community. And I've never met somebody like this before. He said, Dr. Ellis, the church got a skilled trade education with the GI Bill back in 51, because all the money pushed all of our schools that were offering skilled trade into white collar education. That's where the money went, and all of our colleges followed. We haven't had a faith-based trade school in the state of Texas since 52. And you look at that, and you look at the powers that be that are making these top-down decisions, and suddenly you have entire communities out in West Texas where we work, where there are dozens of $1-million tractors sitting in fields because you just simply don't have the mechanics to go work on the tractors. And you look at that and you have to ask the question, is that flourishing? Like, is that human flourishing? And what I'm not saying is that we should just train a bunch of kind of knuckle dragger monkey wrench guys that only know how to turn a bolt, but we should be deeply investing in the human formation of those people that are actually building strong, flourishing, sustainable communities. And I describe this as, you know, the metaphor I typically use is the development of kind of organic foods. And at some point, somebody came up and said, maybe we shouldn't all be buying food from Monsanto with sterile, non-reproducible seeds that we can't even plant that food when we're done with it. And they had to create this whole kind of organic food movement, you know, over the 80s, 90s, 2000s. What we're really looking at is we're having to ask ourselves, are we content with a human formational system that is leaving us with sterile, non-reproducible communities that are there to serve other parties instead of serving the formation of our communities and our families? And what is it going to take back governance of that space? And I've become convinced that the people who are pushing for these things, who are pushing for the playgrounds, suddenly I find myself asking, who was paid to build the playground? Because somebody was paid to build the playground. Somebody was paid to build a $30 million campus. All of this subsidiary work, somebody's getting paid. And I'm just no longer content to let our children be the milk cow from which all of these other service providers are feeding. And I really do think that kind of imagery is the imagery that we have to start to get in front of our parents when we think about who's the beneficiary of this work. And I think that private education at least gives the accountability to say, we'll fire you if you get out of your line. And if you're not serving the primary needs, there's accountability. And I do not see that accountability within the vast majority of the public system spaces in the US or really anywhere else we've ever been. So, and that's a harsh indictment. I'm being fairly blunt on this, but I think that, we have to ask ourselves, who is the beneficiary of these systems? And it certainly does not seem to be the flourishing family. Is that
do you want to give us any kind of heads up or warning about the newest buzzword for socialism, the public-private partnerships? We're fighting that here in our country, of course, with the ESAs, the vouchers, the tax credits, all infiltrating private education, auspices. Of course, the public bureaucrat should hire a private company to do something better.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
Well, we just, again, follow the money. Who's the beneficiary? And ultimately, are we exchanging, shackles for shekels on this? And, what kind of constraints does this give us to provide self-governance in our systems? And that's, so the key words, you've mentioned a few of them in the States. The thing is that internationally, where we do a lot of our work, it's so many layers of outsourcing. They've already been so infiltrated that they have to criminalize parental governance because that's the only way to keep it from happening. Because everybody knows it's broken. Everybody knows other people are getting paid to the point of graft, corruption, all that kind of stuff that's mentioned in the book. Well, you have to criminalize it. Otherwise, parents will find a better way for their kids because ultimately they care about the kids more than the bureaucrats. And so I think that looking at the criminalization, looking at the bureaucratization. Every time that layer comes in, why is that layer being inserted? And I think that, when we look at these things coming into the States, we have to take a very, very hard, long look at these things and saying, who is being benefited? Where's the beneficiary? And are we giving over governance? And I just think most of our parents are just looking at the money and not understanding.
Because they think their children are the beneficiaries. They're getting somebody else's money, and they don't think of it in what you've described as a subsidiary, and that lack of governance is now they basically sold it. Sounds like you've been reading the same books we've been reading, Nick.
Well, I think we've been reading the same books and very much leading the same lives, working with families, working with communities. And just like the author of this book, you actually get into the communities and you actually look at the actual work on the ground. You get your hands dirty, you get your finger in the mud, you get your knuckles on the dirt, and you start to see, certainly don't trust Oxfam's reports. Let's just put it that way. That is not where the results are actually given. And so I think we're just in the communities. And, I think that's what we're also concerned about, is that we're actually with those families, looking at the outcomes, looking at our communities, looking at our suburbs, looking at our rural environments, and we're looking at the outcomes and saying, there's been a lot of people that have made money on this, but where are the outcomes for flourishing communities? And they just don't exist. So that's my experience anyways. And I think we're all kind of seeing this percolate through the political sphere as well.
You, Nicole, is your connection good enough to ask a question?
I think so. So you talked a lot about human flourishing, and I kind of want to know, like, I've heard that word a lot. I feel like that's a kind of a common buzzword, but how would you define human flourishing based on like a biblical Christian view?
That's great. Well, a better way of saying it is winning at life. So let's boil it down to even grittier terms. Like, how do you define winning at life? When you come to the end of your life and you say, we have created a healthy result with how we've all invested the 50, 60, 70 years that God's given us. And when I look at flourishing communities and flourishing family units, this vision of go work, put your money in your retirement account, send your kids off somewhere that you don't have to worry about them, and then retire to Jupiter to play golf, and hopefully you run out of money about the time that you die. When we look at that, we have to ask, have you won at life? Like, is that how God's designed families and communities to flourish and self-sustain? And you look at an immigrant family who's moved to Southwest Dallas and has their children around them and their great-grandchildren around them, working in the family business, with following the teachings of their fathers. And you have to ask the question of who's won at life when they die. And so when we look at kind of a whole picture of human flourishing, what does it mean to be created? What does it mean to create? What does it mean to leave a legacy? I'm just not convinced that the modern vision of flourishing, because you're right, it's a buzzword, but let's go in and define it. At the end of your life, surrounded by your family, continuing to propagate the teachings of your fathers, has that been accomplished? And so that's what I'm looking at when I'm looking at flourishing communities and human formation. Different people will define it differently. Some people say, well, you need to have X amount in your retirement account. Some people say, there's a lot of different ways of defining this, but that's how I'm going to define winning at life. And that's what we're going to build for, with our families and the communities that we're investing in.
Well, that's really good. I am actually wanting to share something on the bottom of page 91. I understand everyone might not have the book handy, but it reminds me of this quote here where Dr. Tooley is talking about how one of the principals of a private school, his wife is doing the field work, and the principal is explaining to, I think it was Dr. Tooley, about why he does what he does. And he says, other people have different hobbies, this is my hobby to run a school, it would be impossible for me to give up this occupation for any other. And that might sound disconnected from what you were saying, but to me, it's one and the same in that you're making discipleship and education of your children inextricable with who you are and your duties owed to God. And I think it's an excellent reminder, even for me, to focus on what's important. Actually, my nephew was visiting last weekend, and he's, I know Stephen Covey wrote that book, 7 Habits, which is not overtly Christian. I think he borrowed quite heavily from Jesus, but he talks about the big rocks and then the little pebbles. You know, you got to focus on the big rocks and then the little pebbles. And I think with what we're talking about here is you got to focus on the big important things, especially generationally. And that's really what's going to be pleasing to God, but ultimately pleasing to our souls. And I know just growing up in not necessarily a Christian household, what has been satisfying to me as Christian and then as a homeschool parent is seeing my family be at peace with what we're doing, even though we're making sacrifices that many of these families are making in what Dr. Tooley's talking about here. So.
So one question I'd like to ask you, Nick, that will feel unrelated, but you'll might have a good answer for us is, I know that you use the word post-secondary and, you know, college students and things like that. With classical conversations, we're looking more and more to expanding into the college age realm of children, young adults. And I hate saying they're college age. It's like it's a nod right to the very system we're trying to get out of. And you said post-secondary, so here we are in another school term. And if I say young adults, I often feel like somebody thinks I'm talking about YA literature, right? Which is really bad for anybody to read. So what are you calling these days, those 18 to 25-year-olds?
Oh, man. Well, in Europe, it's like young children because they're only getting married at 35 and they don't leave their parents' houses until, you know, 30. So it really depends. But when I say post-secondary, I would say that most of our communities have a sense of, at least within the private school and homeschool sectors, of what it means to govern those spaces, you know, K through 12, you know, all these other kind of arbitrary cutoff dates that some Prussian, you know, came up with, you know, 100 years ago. And so when I say post-secondary, I'm trying to say you need to extend your governance as a community past that arbitrary 12th grade that is completely and totally arbitrary to any kind of, you know, educational soul formation question. And in fact, I would say that if you think about education, soul formation, you know, the forming of an eternal soul, the forming of a person, that's what education is. Right about 17 and 18, you're just about ready to start to reap some of the greatest rewards of forming those souls, just at the point where all public systems and structures say, thank you very much, we'll gladly take those souls now. And when we start thinking about community-based parental community governance post-secondary, if I can get people to do one extra grade, a gap year, a quote unquote 13th grade, that breaks the spell because they quickly see, wow, that worked out pretty well. Maybe that 31-year-old woke little Marxist from Berkeley isn't a better teacher for my 17 or 18-year-old than our elders and leaders within our community. Maybe that's not true. And suddenly 14th grade, quote unquote, sophomore, junior, senior, all those kind of dominoes start to fall very, very quickly. And I also say post-secondary because I don't like buying into the idea that college is the only space for self-governance after high school, because it's not college. Trade school, gap year, apprenticeship, taking over the family business, all of these things are human formational contexts that most of us have abandoned because we think the only option is an elite outsourcing to a third party because now they're 18. And what a tragedy. And what a foolish idea that someone else should now kind of move into the wisdom transfer posture for people, just as they're starting to move into some of the main wisdom questions of marriage and family and investment and debt and real estate. I mean, these are the decisions that will guide your lifetime, and they're being made now by let's send them all to College Station and Texas A&M, where there's 70,000 other 18 to 23 to 24-year-olds all making the same decisions, and we'll just kind of hope that wisdom occurs organically within that particular petri dish. And I would simply say, let's make sure that we're putting systems in place where data transfer is not the primary outcome, but wisdom transfer from generation to generation is the primary outcome that we're looking at in the formational space. Data, we have never had more access to data at any other time in history than we do right now. You do not have to go to a campus to get data, but campuses are not very good at transferring wisdom. And so we have to kind of reconfigure what we're looking to do. And, most parents are just like, they're never going to find that girl and go get married. So we have to send them off to a campus. My biggest concern is actually that most of our parents are sending their children off because they don't particularly like the product that they've made. So this is going to get pretty tough hitting, I think, unfortunately. But most of our moms and dads are saying, I don't really like what I produced here. I don't really know what to do with them. I don't have a vision for this person. We need to send them off to somebody else because I don't really want them around anymore. And that is a tragic indictment of the very systems, if that's what we're producing within our families. So it's systemic. K through university, soul formation, wisdom transfer. That's when I need to take a step back and say, is this subsidizing and subsidiary approach to soul formation working if I don't even want my kids around working in my family business by the time they turn 19? So anyways, I probably went too deep and I went too far there on that one. So I'll throw that out there. But I think that is the kind of stuff that we need to be thinking about when we think about organic, local, sustainable soul formation of people.
Well, really quick, if you don't mind me asking. So, as an attorney, I kind of break things up into substantive law and procedural law. So we could teach our children wisdom. That, to me, would be substantive law. But when you talk about the parents not having necessarily a game plan until they send their children off to college, that to me is procedural, and that they don't really know what to do. And so that to me is generational. So my question to you is, when we're teaching our younger people, are we also teaching them to think about the things you're talking about here? In other words, breaking that cycle of humanism.
Yeah, well, we certainly have to start early, and we have to start redefining for them, what does flourishing mean? What does soul formation mean? What does community mean? All of these kind of definitions. Is working in a trade a bad, dirty thing? If they've never been exposed to good, productive work, we do a lot of apprenticeship programs and fold in like a work study kind of collegiate program with business partners that we work with and provide them, apprenticeship models. We have kids that have graduated from college that have never worked a single shift of work ever. And now they graduate and they're 24 and they have $170,000 of debt and they've never actually worked a shift. Because we've told them, you go work and that's dirty. That's not honorable. Mm-hmm. And so how are they going to become productive people in their communities when they have absolutely no idea of what it means to be a productive, hardworking person? That has to shift early. And if there's no game plan, if you're just following along with whatever the teachers want to sell you, and I don't want to say teachers, because I think teachers are generally good people that are trying to do a tough job, but they are bound within a system that will work against them. And so that's where I think we need to redefine some of these core definitions of parental governance, soul formation, and human flourishing in the educational space.
So Kevin,
Fine.
I'm going to ask you to pray. Emma and I have another meeting we have to go to. Nick, you're going to come back next week, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
All
I'll
right.
save my question
Michelle.
for next week.
Yeah. Good. We'll open with you, Michelle.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah,
I'll write it down so I don't forget.
Michelle, you do have a job to do, though, before I pray.
Oh, yes. If you're enjoying this lovely conversation that we are having, would you please hit the like and subscribe button? The more people we get to like it, the more people that we get to subscribe, the more people that this will go out to, and it'll pop up in their feeds, and we would really appreciate it. And I know that there will be lots and lots of people out there that would love to hear Dr. Ellis speak tonight. So we'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for joining us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much. We're so thankful for you being a wonderful God and just sharing yourself with us in so many different ways, just with your creation, with your Son, with your Holy Spirit, with other humans that are wise and they can share that information with us. So we hope that we can continue to sharpen each other's swords, not just with Dr. Ellis and our participants, but many other people. And I do pray specifically for these people that Dr. Truly writes about in his book. So many hundreds and hundreds of students and young people and parents who have now grown older, but we do pray for them. And only you know their names, but we do pray for them specifically. I just pray for worldwide education freedom, that we can understand what wisdom really is, what we need to know about, what your true aims are for us as people. Not to have a high net worth, but to pass on Christianity to the generations and ultimately bring glory to you and your Son. I pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you for the invite. Great to chat with you tonight.
Okay.